There's something very funny, very stupid, and very realistic about an entire continent's history hinging upon the actions of a comparatively tiny faction that has all the right pieces to screw with everyone else's plans. The might of entire empires and age-old institutions undone by this seeming nobody, who somehow is always the one upsetting the status quo. Whether it's upstart colonies outlasting the most powerful empire on Earth, a ragtag bunch of heroes out to change the world, or a tiny clan in the mountains trying to get by. People love an underdog. No matter how often they win, the House of Wolfort is always an underdog. Hello, back around the hearth one last time as we explore the northern continent of Norzelia. Norzelia. Wait a minute, and the last faction of significance that we directly see influence the world throughout the story. That, of course, being the central House of Wolfort, the warrior clan that never quite fit in with anyone else, and yet managed to seize power again and again, changing history across the continent. And it began in a predictably unassuming way. So the legends say, a lone warrior followed a hawk northeast of the then Kingdom of Glenbrook, into unsettled lands where many tribes, including the tribes of Falks and Telior, lived. This warrior found a mountain and started building a hall, and from that hall he began unifying the tribes into the single greater House of Wolfort. For an untold period of time, the House of Wolfort would remain the best independent figure in Norzelia, possibly even existing before the Duchy of Esfrost broke away from the kingdom. Wolfort's capital began to grow from the same mountain until it naturally grew into one of the best defended cities in Norzelia, and one of the most comfortable to live in. With special canals that help carry away waste and secretly can be filled with oil to trigger war crimes, the people of the Wolfort domain grew comfortable, honest, and simply kind folk that, like their leaders, often didn't worry much about continent-spanning ambitions. It's not clear entirely how far their domain stretched at that point, but I think it likely included parts of modern-day Telior and possibly most of Falk's domain. But for certain, the central region between the two rivers has always been Wolfort territory. In this agrarian society, every citizen could sustain themselves off the land and with total trust in their lord to protect them, leaving the worries of the other nations far beyond their minds. But, of course, one can only remain uninvolved for so long. Tensions broiled with the nations around them. Esfrost and Glenbrook were burdened by the taxes on salt due to the monopoly Hyzant held with the source, and the two nations schemed and strategized to undo this. Ultimately, they launched a surprise invasion of Hyzant, leaving the theocracy very little time to get into a defensive position, as Esfrost tore past their borders and besieged their capital city. At the last minute, the Hierophant of Hyzant sent a message to the ruling lord of Wolfort, Simon, a proud, glory-seeking warrior who, for reasons all his own, would respond to the call and lead an elite force across the desert and rivers to attack the sieging army of Esfrost. The frankly reckless attack shattered Esfrost's hold as Hyzant was able to fight back and send the war into a more even playing field. The battle lines of the Salt Iron War had been drawn, and it would devastate the continent. Wolfort felt this drastically, as even in the modern day there are abandoned villages in their territory which appear to have been left to ruin due to or following the Salt Iron War. The war proved a distinguishing time for House Wolfort, where the legends of their warriors could become known. Simon was the most obvious, considered to be an unparalleled warrior, save for perhaps by the greatest generals of Esfrost and Hyzant. But so too were those who fought beside and for him, such as Landroy Fox, leader of the Falks clan, an archer who went into battle alongside Simon, or Gore Telior, advisor to Simon. There were furthermore his retainers and confidants, Benedict Pascal and Erator Ballantine, who may have gone less overtly praised, but they too served Wolfort spectacularly. Erador was a living wall of a man whose endurance would outlast the war, while it was Benedict's bold and sometimes brash plans that snatched victory from the jaws of defeat time and time again. Altogether, they made the Wolfort army feared and respected by keeping back the armies of Esfrost and Glenbrook from the shuddering Hyzant. But not all was well with the two sides. The salt reserves of Esfrost and Glenbrook began to run dry as Glenbrook's king Regna grew dissatisfied with the war Esfrost had drug it into. Meanwhile, Wolfort's ally of Hyzant was too busy burning itself to the ground to really be helpful. The Hierophant died of illness and caused a power struggle in the middle of the war, and to further exacerbate their problems, the Roselle, the enslaved people who Hyzant forced to produce the salt that fueled their economic power, revolted, and waves of them fled the Holy State. Many found their way into Wolfort territory, and their leader Orlea made a deal with Simon, relegating space for a Roselle village not too far from the Wolfort capital. Somewhere in here, or sometime following, Simon became disillusioned with the war and his ally in Hyzant, seeing the whole affair as pointless and overly costly. So, when he received an invitation from King Regna to secret negotiations, he took the offer, and together they orchestrated the end of the Saltire War by leveraging their better-equipped armies against the exhausted Esfrost and Hyzant. As a part of this deal, they created the Norzelia Consortium to regulate trade between the monopolies that had led the war to begin with. Next, the Wolfort clan would become vassals of Glenbrook as a powerful, unified opposition to the other two nations. It was not entirely even, however, as Regna had the House of Wolfort split into three, with the main domain held by Simon, while Gorde and Telior were named fellow High House lords and given land further away from Wolfort. This was to weaken the formidable Wolfort, just in case their ambitions grew. This anticipated ambition was also something Regna was kind of hoping for, since he was dueling with the Royalists, an unwieldy faction of nobles that entrenched themselves further into the politics and bureaucracies of the kingdom. He had hoped the new high houses would create a counterbalance that the Royalists would be unable to compete with. But ironically, the ambition he feared and counted on did not manifest. The simpler, more honest souls of Wolfort were expressed in their lords, who came from it. None of the high houses sought to increase their power, only to govern their own lands and keep their people happy. Landroy secured the southern grainlands, Gorde occupied and oversaw the vital reservoir to the north, and Simon remained on the front line as a vanguard between his new king and the bitter Esfrost and Hyzant. In this new status quo, things were still rocky in the new expanded Glenbrook, particularly because of a certain incident with the king and a woman named Destra. Now, this is a story that has gone unmentioned up to this point for one obvious reason. It only matters to the story of Wolfort, and because if you played the games, you likely know what I'm about to talk about. In the years right after the Saltire War, Regna met a common-born woman named Destra, and began a whirlwind affair with her, one which led to her getting pregnant. Regna was left with a few terrible choices. One, he could admit to it and try to legitimize the child and Destra, creating a scandal that would likely end in Destra and their baby being killed by royalists who'd hate for such a scandal to tarnish the image of the nobles and the royals. Or he could just brush her off and abandon her to a life as a single mother in a medieval setting, with the constant chance for the royalists to assassinate her anyway. So, once more, Simon Wolfort came to the rescue. In the service of the king, it would seem he too had met Destra, and he too had fallen in love with her. On seeing the sorry state that she was in, Simon agreed to take her in, marry her, and claim the child as his own. Regna agreed and sent a royal signet ring as a proof of the child's origin, just in case the truth ever had to be known. So it was done, with Destra becoming the lady of House Wolfort and beloved quickly by its people, most especially Benedict, who was in awe of her, and grew resentful of how she was treated by Regna and even Simon to an extent. This awe and admiration grew into deep devotion as he and Eredor served Wolfort in the decades after, alongside helping to raise the son she'd have. Born of royal blood to a common mother and raised as the son of a warrior lord, Serenoa Wolfort's past would remain shrouded for most of his life, as Eredor taught him to fight, Benedict taught him to think, and Simon taught him to lead. Serenoa grew to be a capable swordsman and effective leader, though he often fell short of the comparisons to his heroic father. He came to be loved and trusted by Wolfort, and while Destra would pass away in the ensuing decades, her impact continues to influence the decisions of those left behind. Benedict, remembering how she was traded around like a pawn, swore to lead her son to greatness, and Simon hoped only for Serenoa to grow into his role as lord of his house. A role Serenoa would have to take sooner than most, as Simon's health became tenuous. A failing heart and a body racked by old wounds, Simon knew his days were numbered. By the time we reach the events of Triangle Strategy, Glenbrook and the High Houses are at the forefront of the Grand Norzelian Mines project, designed to cool rising tensions between Esfrost and, well, everyone that isn't Esfrost. It set up two important signs of unity. The first was the mines themselves in Wolfort territory with Esfrosti techniques, and the second was the betrothal of the Esfrosti Archduke's half-sister Frederica to Serenoa as a further show of support. Frederica, daughter to Orlea and the former Archduke, returned to the land where her mother's people had found rest and was able to marry into the house of the man who allowed it to happen. With her came her cousin, Dragan, whose understanding of explosives made him an excellent choice for overseer to the mines. With this new age set to begin, Simon graciously abdicated his title and handed his son a final gift: the Scales of Conviction, a seemingly magical device which responds to the convictions and ideals of those who interact with it. With 7 tokens, chosen people vote upon a dedicated path, and the House of Wolfort follows it implicitly. The choice of who would hold these tokens is a monumental one, and Serenoa chooses wisely soon after. The 7 tokens are given to Benedict, Erador, Frederica and her tutor Gila, Serenoa's best friend and the second prince of Glenbrook Roland, and his retainer Huette, and Anna, Benedict's adoptive daughter and another retainer and trusted confidant to Serenoa. These 7, with the input and the deliberation of Serenoa, would become the backbone of House Wolfort and the Scales, which would be much needed as the hoped peace would not last. Conflict arose over the discovery of salt crystals in the Grand Norzelian mines, known only to a select few, specifically Dragan and Esfrost's Archduke Gustadolf, but as we know by now, it ended with Dragan dead and Esfrost invading Glenbrook to cover their tracks while also trying to steal the mines. In a moment, the defenses of the high houses collapsed. Serenoa was busy at the mines trying and failing to protect Dragan. Simon's forces were stalled by him suffering a near-fatal heart attack upon hearing the news of Esfrost's invasion, which sent him into a coma. Landroy Fawkes was too far in the south and received word too late to help, and Intelior, the son of Gorde, Silvio, was lord, and he left Glenbrook to fend for itself to preserve him and his own domain. Serenoa's forces alone tried to break into the capital to save the royal family, but they were separated from Regna and his other children, Crown Prince Franny, who was killed in front of them, and Princess Cordelia, who was taken prisoner. With only Roland in their care and his mentor Maxwell presumed dead in the process, the Second Great War of Norzelia had begun while Serenoa spirited Roland away to safety. Triangle Strategy's story, as you likely know by now, expands from here based on the story and gameplay effects of the Scales of Conviction, and the 7 main characters whose ideals shape the path House Wolfort takes. For the most part, Frederica represents naturally humane ideas associated with liberty. Roland has a more straightforward, honor-bound sense of morality, while Benedict's proposals tend to center around pragmatic utility. The rest of the characters tend to follow whoever they're closest to, though Anna and Erador are just as often undecided. Bit by bit, Serenoa's own resolve is tested as he trusts in the decisions made by his peers and by the Scales of Conviction. Whether it's to abandon or protect Roland, to ally with the traitorous Silvio, or go along with a corrupt Hyzantian minister who wants to drag them into his schemes. The path forward is determined by the choices of the entire house, and Serenoa executes their choices. Sound familiar? Though somewhat obfuscated and on a smaller level, House Wolfort functions like a 2-level republic almost. 7 representatives of the entire house and a single leader who does not vote but instead executes the decisions made and adheres to them. He can persuade and debate with others to alter their decisions, but at the end of the day, he does not vote. He only acts upon what is decided. This has a habit of making Serenoa come across as, ironically, without convictions of his own, but that could not be further from the truth. In fact, his convictions are rooted in the combined knowledge and wisdom of the Scales. That is also his weakness. Often Serenoa will follow the decisions enforced by the Scales of Conviction independent of his own feelings, and this results in some painful choices for him. Even so, he pushes on. The corruption of the Hyzantian minister Sorceley, who had ingratiated himself to Wolfort, is revealed regardless of the path chosen, and Serenoa is put into a position to take his place as one of the saintly 7 of Hyzan, a dark reflection of his own council. But unlike his own, in Hyzant all is secretly ordained by Idor del Mira, Minister of Religion. If you want his whole deal, I've got a video of his and Hyzant's story you should watch. The Cliff Notes is this: he is a puppet master with a false hierophant that he pretends to hear the words of and instead merely speaking for. And this puppeteer demands Serenoa as a minister of Hyzant hand over the Roselle within his territory, betraying the promise and legacy of his father. This, as we've spoken of a few times before, can go a few ways with worse consequences if you do the obviously terrible thing. Again, to avoid rehashing what I've already talked about in a past video, we'll keep this brief. Serenoa gets Hyzant on his side, whether through capitulating or leveraging the discovery of salt crystals against them. They attack Glenbrook's capital and retake it, and Serenoa begins to feel the weight of Hyzant bearing down on him to leave Glenbrook to serve them. Soon, Simon awakes from his coma and reaches out to his son. Of course, you can choose to just outright ignore him if you like, but not if you want the golden ending. More on that later. Shortly after this and other crossroads, several world-shaking events happen in Serenoa's life. First, his father is assassinated by nobles from Glenbrook, who sought to use the confusion to end the High Houses and their control once and for all. Frederica discovers the true history of Norzelia and the past of the Roselle. Roland annihilates the last of the nobles in brutal fashion that begins to fray the public's trust in him, his own faith in the country he leads, and his ability to lead it. They discover the salt crystals in the Grand Norzelian mines, and last but most certainly not least, Serenoa learns the truth of his lineage. He is presented with the royal signet and told either by Simon or Benedict the true story of Destra. All of this happens in like a week. It's a wonder Serenoa doesn't have a heart attack himself at this point. With so much before them and all their enemies gearing up to fight for the salt crystals, we reach the point we've discussed in every video so far. The final choice and the defining moment of many characters, especially Serenoa. Frederica insists they free the Roselle and escape to their homeland of Centralia, leaving Norzelia and its problems behind. Roland, crushed by the weight of responsibility, wants to hand the salt crystals to Hyzant and allow their cruel and false sense of equality to rule. Meanwhile, Benedict wishes to ally with Esfrost to snuff out Hyzant, and he suggests to Serenoa that he use his secret lineage to usurp Roland, seizing control and becoming the king Benedict always knew he could become. And you must decide as well. And you must decide how to convince the others who aren't the primary leaders. Everyone else can be coerced, but they are set in their ways and unwilling to reconcile their beliefs with one another. To take one side is to alienate another irreversibly, and Serenoa knows it. So once more, he must swallow his feelings as the tokens are cast, and a decision is made. If Frederica gets her way, Benedict will refuse to abandon the domain he has protected, and the past that he is chained to, even to the point of drawing a blade against his lord. Similarly, Roland can't abide allying with Esfrost, and upon Benedict revealing Serenoa's true lineage, he challenges his brother to a duel for the fate of Glenbrook. And Frederica, well, do you expect her to do nothing when you sell out her entire people? So, yes, of course Frederica drops the sun on him. Every time, Serenoa's convictions overpower those who stand against him as he bends himself to the whims of the scales, choosing not to object, but abiding by whatever decision is made no matter who he loses in the process. But every decision leaves him trapped. Roland's path leaves him trapped in a gilded cage where pieces of facade over the pain and misery others must suffer to create it, as he turns a blind eye to said suffering for his friend's vision. In Benedict's path, he becomes trapped by the old man's regret and spite, his desire to reshape Serenoa and Glenbrook into something that will always be remembered, something that is wholly different from who Serenoa really is. And even in Frederica's path, he loses his people and becomes trapped in the state of incorporeality as he becomes atomized by an exploding Edor. Listen, if you want context to that, watch the other videos. I've done this 4 times already. All these paths lead to Serenoa's sacrifice. Sacrifice of life, sacrifice of heart, sacrifice of autonomy. That is why the golden ending is the one path that only he could make. The golden ending requires Serenoa to do just about everything right. First, he has to not use the oil traps in Wolfort, whether because he abstained from using it while Esfrost invades, or because you hand over Roland to prevent it. Then you have to agree to smuggle salt for Sorcery, which allows Serenoa to meet with and convince Frederica's uncle, aka Dragan's grieving father, Svarog, to ally with you. You also have to refuse to hand over the Roselle, and lastly travel to meet Simon personally before he is assassinated, for him to reveal the truth to Serenoa himself. Do all these things, and the way forward is left open. A path Serenoa is able to see and decide for himself. One that does not rely on the scales of conviction. Setting the scales aside, Serenoa puts his own convictions forward, rather than swallowing them in the name of consensus. And by doing so, he allows the others to grow as well. He divides his army into 3, with Benedict defending Wolfort, while Roland buries his hate and doubt to seek Esfrost's aid, giving Frederica the chance to free the Roselle. Benedict uses the oil traps to successfully ward off the Hyzantine army, and Roland and Svarog take down Gustadolf once and for all, with Frederica and the Roselle meeting up with them and their new Esfrosti allies to plan the assault on Hyzant. In short order, Serenoa leads the unified army to break the Hyzantine army, shatter the walls of their city that they called the Goddess's Shield, and convince the second-to-last minister of Hyzant and the only one left with an ounce of redeemable qualities, Lila Viscraft, to stand down. All that is left is Edor, the man whose 6 schemes threatened the continent as much as any other. Edor once faced a conundrum just like Serenoa. In the Salt Iron War, when the Hierophant died, suddenly the Saintly Seven turned on each other and splintered due to infighting. much as Serenoa almost faced. And not too unlike Serenoa, rather than capitulating to the whims of the squabbling, he crafted his own plan for the future. But unlike Serenoa, Idor did not trust those around him. Instead, he looked down on and manipulated them. And now, with no other options, he channels the last of his power and the power of the Aelfric into himself to achieve a state equivalent to a demigod, so that in his new immortality he might force his future upon Norzelia, free of the same discontent he and Serenoa were plagued by. Serenoa learned what Idor couldn't, however. He saw the way to dream for better and make it so, to finally be rid of all doubts. So Idor battles the army of Wolfort, comprised of people from every corner of the land. From former enemies, bandits, merchants, blacksmiths, the greatest generals and warriors of this and the previous generation, and the 7 souls who've shouldered this path with their leader so far, and the lone demigod who could not trust anyone but himself collapsed in defeat. Idor dies believing that even if Serenoa creates a brighter future, the stupidity and selfishness of man will tear it down. And while he may be right, Serenoa will not stop walking forward. For so long as he does that, there will always be a better future to fight for. As the new Norzelia is unified under a revivified Glenbrook, new, more autonomous territories are established from the regions. Gone are the royalist, saintly sevens, and high houses, and instead the lands of Esfrost, Hyzant, and Wolfort are given each a governor to watch over them in the king's stead. Svarog for Esfrost, Lila for Hyzant, and of course, the hero of this war and the young hawk himself, Serenoa, as governor of the Wolfort domain. After great trial and strife, doubt and misfortune, the Lord of Wolfort had at last lived up to the dreams of his fathers and mother, become the man Benedict had hoped he'd become, been the friend Roland had needed, and become the man Frederica loved. His role centered these 3, and allowed them to fulfill their deepest desires without sacrificing anything else in the process. Because sometimes what a person needs most is someone to tell them they're wrong, and offer another way. And in so doing, he'd create the perfect conditions for Esfrost to rise from the ashes, Glenbrook to be cleared of corruption, Hyzant to shake off its gilded chains, and the Roselle to live freely. In the coming Norzelia, Serenoa would not become a king, a saint, or a martyr. He'd become what he'd always wanted to be, a man and lord equal to, if not greater, than his father. And that will be all for Norzelia. Triangle strategy left an indelible impact on me, for being the right combination of tactical gameplay and immersive decision-making, which immersed me not only in the battles, but the characters who were involved in them. It is oft overlooked, and it occasionally has some funky dubbing, even though I love it. Che Matheson, I've seen you play Kamaravi and Xenoblade. I know you're a great VA. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Despite this, it's a great encapsulation of everything that makes tactical RPGs wonderful, and I can only hope that more people get into this game. If you're watching this and have never played it, well, what are you doing here? I thank you for coming this far, but really, what are you doing here? Luckily for you, I didn't cover every nook and cranny of the characters in this game. I never even explained the deal with Evlora, or Anna's backstory, or who Milo is, or Travis and Trish. Can you believe I got this far without ever talking about Travis or Trish? Needless to say, while it's kind of funky if this is how you did find it, I still heavily suggest you pick up Triangle Strategy and give it a playthrough for yourself, because there is still so much to enjoy and much greater depth than I can convey in these videos alone. A great big shout out to all my lovely patrons, whose contributions encourage me to keep up the good work. If you'd like to support the channel, consider becoming a patron or a YouTube member for just $3 a month, for which you can gain access to early content, a private Discord to hang out in a little community, and more ways to directly interact with me. It's all just optional, however, and if you can't or don't want to, that's fine too. Just watching this video does a lot, as does liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing. That bell also lets you know whenever I post next, which tends to be weekly on every Saturday. So far, I've kept that streak up for the last 6 months or so, which is a pretty good record. Now, I've got more videos planned in the coming weeks, and a series I've been hoping to get to for a while, and I hope you all stick around for that one too. But until then, I have been the Hearth Guy, and say it with me now, I will see you all next time, around the hearth.
Hey, you're finally awake.
Huh? What? No, wait, where am I? No, not here again. No, I can't go back. Oh. Oh, I remember you. Alright, fine. I guess I'm gonna help a failing rebellion today. Who else is interested in burning down imperialism?